Musicalison, meditation, mantras.
With the same force. In it, I was with the girl I'd been engaged to. At that time, both of us were saving money to be married and have a house of our own. I heard myself demanding that we have a joint checking account. I wouldn't have it any other way. I felt an imperative need to lecture her on frugality. I heard myself telling her where to buy her clothes and what the top affordable price should be. Then I saw myself giving driving lessons to her younger sister and going veritably berserk when she said that she was planning to move out of her parents' house. Forcefully, I threatened her with canceling my lessons. She wept, confessing that she was having an affair with her boss. I jumped out of the car and began kicking the door. However, that was not all. I heard myself telling my fiancé's father not to move to Oregon, where he planned to go. I shouted at the top of my voice that it was a stupid move. I really believed that my reasonings against it were unbeatable. I presented him with budget figures in which I had meticulously calculated his losses. When he didn't pay any attention to me, I slammed the door and left, shaking with rage. I found my fiancée in the living room, playing her guitar. I pulled it out of her hands and yelled at her that she embraced the guitar instead of playing it, as if it were more than an object. My desire to impose my will extended all across the board. I made no distinctions. Whoever was close to me was there for me to possess and mold, following my whims. I didn't have to ponder any more the significance of my vivid visions, for an unquestionable certainty invaded me as if coming from outside me. It told me that my weak point was the idea that I had to be the man in the director's chair at all times. It had been a deeply ingrained concept with me that I not only had to be in charge, but I had to be in control of any situation. The way in which I'd been brought up had reinforced this drive, which must have been arbitrary at its onset, but had turned in my adulthood into a deep necessity. I was aware, beyond any doubt, that what was at stake was infinity. Don Juan had portrayed it as a conscious force that deliberately intervenes in the lives of sorcerers, and now it was intervening in mine. I knew that infinity was pointing out to me, through the vivid recollection of those forgotten experiences, the intensity and the depth of my drive for control, and thus preparing me for something transcendental to myself. I knew with frightening certainty that something was going to bar any possibility of my being in control, and that I needed, more than anything else, sobriety, fluidity, and abandon in order to face the things that I felt were coming to me. Naturally, I told all this to Don Juan, elaborating to my heart's content on my speculations and inspirational insights about the possible significance of my recollection. Don Juan laughed, good-humoredly.
All this is psychological exaggeration on your part. Wishful thinking, he said. You are, as usual, seeking explanations with linear cause and effect. Each of your recollections becomes more and more vivid, more and more maddening to you, because, as I told you already, you have entered an irreversible process. Your true mind is emerging, waking up from a state of lifelong lethargy. Infinity is claiming you, he continued. Whatever means it uses to point that out to you cannot have any other reason, any other cause, any other value than that. What you should do, however, is to be prepared for the onslaughts of infinity. You must be in a state of continuously bracing yourself for a blow of tremendous magnitude. That is the sane, sober way in which sorcerers face infinity.
Don Juan's words left me with a bad taste in my mouth. I actually sensed the assault coming on me, and I feared it. Since I had spent my entire life hiding behind some superfluous activity, I immersed myself in work. I gave lectures and classes taught by my friends in different schools in Southern California. I wrote copiously. I could say without exaggeration that I threw dozens of manuscripts into the garbage can because they didn't fulfill an indispensable requirement that Don Juan had described to me as the mark of something that is acceptable by infinity. He had said that everything I did had to be an act of sorcery, an act free from encroaching expectations, fears of failure, hopes of success, free from the cult of me. Everything I did had to be impromptu, a work of magic where I freely opened myself to the impulses of the infinite. One night, I was sitting at my desk preparing myself for my daily activity of writing. I felt a moment of grogginess. I thought that I was feeling dizzy because I'd gotten up too quickly from my mat where I'd been doing my exercise. My vision blurred. I saw yellow spots in front of my eyes. I thought I was going to faint. The fainting spell got worse. There was an enormous red spot in front of me. I began to breathe deeply, trying to quiet whatever agitation was causing this visual distortion. I became extraordinarily silent, to the point where I noticed that I was surrounded by impenetrable darkness. The thought crossed my mind that I had fainted. However, I could feel the chair, my desk. I could feel everything around me from inside the darkness that surrounded me. Don Juan had said that the sorcerers of his lineage considered that one of the most coveted results of inner silence was a specific interplay of energy, which is always heralded by a strong emotion. He felt that my recollections were the means to agitate me to the extreme, where I would experience this interplay. Such an interplay manifested itself in terms of hues that were projected on any horizon in the world of everyday life, be it a mountain, the sky, a wall, or simply the palms of the hands. He had explained that this interplay of hues begins with the appearance of a tenuous brushstroke of lavender on the horizon. In time, this lavender brushstroke starts to expand until it covers the visible horizon, like advancing storm clouds. He assured me that a dot of a peculiar, rich pomegranate red shows up as if bursting from the lavender clouds. He stated that as sorcerers become more disciplined and experienced, the dot of pomegranate expands and finally explodes into thoughts or visions, or in the case of a literate man, into written words. Sorcerers either see visions engendered by energy, hear thoughts being voiced as words, or read written words. That night, at my desk, I didn't see any lavender brushstrokes, nor did I see any advancing clouds. I was sure that I didn't have the discipline that sorcerers require for such an interplay of energy, but I had an enormous dot of pomegranate red in front of me. This enormous dot, without any preliminaries, exploded into disassociated words that I read as if they were on a sheet of paper coming out of a typewriter. The words moved at such tremendous speed in front of me that it was impossible to read anything. Then I heard a voice describing something to me. Again, the speed of the voice was wrong for my ears. The words were garbled, making it impossible to hear anything that would make sense. As if that weren't enough, I began to see liverish scenes, like one sees in dreams after a heavy meal. They were baroque, dark, ominous. I began to twirl, and I did so until I got sick to my stomach. The whole event ended there. I felt the effect of whatever had happened to me in every muscle of my body. I was exhausted. This violent intervention had made me angry and frustrated. I rushed to Don Juan's house to tell him about this happening. I sensed that I needed his help more than ever.
There's nothing gentle about sorcerers or sorcery,
Don Juan commented after he heard my story.
This was the first time that infinity descended on you in such a fashion. It was like a blitz. It was a total takeover of your faculties. Insofar as the speed of your visions is concerned, you yourself will have to learn to adjust it. For some sorcerers, that's the job of a lifetime. But from now on, energy will appear to you as if it were being projected onto a movie screen. Whether or not you understand the projection, he went on, is another matter. In order to make an accurate interpretation, you need experience. My recommendation is that you shouldn't be bashful. You should begin now. Read energy on the wall. Your true mind is emerging, and it has nothing to do with the mind that is a foreign installation. Let your true mind adjust the speed. Be silent, and don't fret, no matter what happens.
But Don Juan, is all this possible? Can one actually read energy as if it were a text? I asked, overwhelmed by the idea.
Of course it's possible,
he retorted.
In your case, it's not only possible, it's happening to you.
But why reading it as if it were a text? I insisted. But it was a rhetorical insistence.
It's an affectation on your part, he said. If you read the text, you could repeat it verbatim. However, if you tried to be a viewer of infinity instead of a reader of infinity, you would find that you could not describe whatever you were viewing, and you would end up babbling inanities, incapable of verbalizing what you witnessed. The same thing if you tried to hear it. This is, of course, specific to you. Anyway, infinity chooses. The warrior traveler simply acquiesces to the choice. But above all,
he added, after a calculated pause,
don't be overwhelmed by the event because you cannot describe it. It is an event beyond the syntax of our language.
Journeys through the dark sea of awareness.
We can speak a little more clearly now about inner silence, Don Juan said.
His statement was such a non sequitur that it startled me. He'd been talking to me all afternoon about the vicissitudes that the Yaqui Indians had suffered after the big Yaqui Wars of the 20s, when they were deported by the Mexican government from their native homeland in the state of Sonora in northern Mexico to work in sugarcane plantations in central and southern Mexico. The Mexican government had had problems with endemic wars with the Yaqui Indians for years. Don Juan told me some astounding, poignant Yaqui stories of political intrigue and betrayal, deprivation, and human misery. I had the feeling that Don Juan was setting me up for something because he knew that those stories were my cup of tea, so to speak. I had, at that time, an exaggerated sense of social justice and fair play.
Circumstances around you have made it possible for you to have more energy, he went on. You have started the recapitulation of your life. You've looked at your friends for the first time as if they were in a display window. You arrived at your breaking point, all by yourself, driven by your own needs. You cancel your business, and above all, you have accrued enough inner silence. All of these made it possible for you to make a journey through the dark sea of awareness. Meeting me in that town of our choice was that journey, he continued. I know that a crucial question almost reached the surface in you, and that for an instant you wondered if I really came to your house. My coming to see you wasn't a dream for you. I was real, wasn't I?
You were as real as anything could be, I said. I had nearly forgotten about those events, but I remembered that it did seem strange to me that he'd found my apartment. I had discarded my astonishment by the simple process of assuming that he'd asked someone for my new address, although if I had been pressed, I wouldn't have been able to come up with the identity of anyone who would have known where I lived.
Let us clarify this point, he continued. In my terms, which are the terms of the sorcerers of ancient Mexico, I was as real as I could have been, and as such I actually went to your place from my inner silence to tell you about the requisite of infinity, and to warn you that you were about to run out of time. And you, in turn, from your inner silence, veritably went to that town of our choice to tell me that you had succeeded in fulfilling the requisite of infinity. In your terms, which are the terms of the average man, it was a dream fantasy in both instances. You had a dream fantasy that I came to your place without knowing the address, and then you had a dream fantasy that you went to see me. As far as I'm concerned, as a sorcerer, what you consider your dream fantasy of meeting me in that town was as real as the two of us talking here today. I confessed to Don Juan that there was no possibility of my framing those events in a pattern of thought proper to Western man. I said that to think of them in terms of dream fantasy was to create a false category that couldn't stand up under scrutiny, and that the only quasi-explanation that was vaguely possible was another aspect of his knowledge, dreaming. No, it is not dreaming,
he said emphatically.
This is something more direct and more mysterious. By the way, I have a new definition of dreaming for you today, more in accordance with your state of being. Dreaming is the act of changing the point of attachment with the dark sea of awareness. If you view it in this fashion, it's a very simple concept and a very simple maneuver. It takes all you have to realize it, but it's not an impossibility, nor is it something surrounded with mystical clouds. Dreaming is a term that has always bugged the hell out of me,
he continued,
because it weakens a very powerful act. It makes it sound arbitrary. It gives a sense of being a fantasy. And this is the only thing it is not. I tried to change the term myself, but it's too ingrained. Maybe someday you could change it yourself, although, as with everything else in sorcery, I'm afraid that by the time you could actually do it, you won't give a damn about it, because it won't make any difference what it is called anymore.
Don Juan had explained at great length during the entire time that I'd known him that dreaming was an art discovered by the sorcerers of ancient Mexico, by means of which ordinary dreams were transformed into bona fide entrances to other worlds of perception. He advocated, in any way he could, the advent of something he called dreaming attention, which was the capacity to pay a special kind of attention or to place a special kind of awareness on the elements of an ordinary dream. I'd followed meticulously all his recommendations and had succeeded in commanding my awareness to remain fixed on the elements of a dream. The idea that Don Juan proposed was not to set out deliberately to have a desired dream, but to fix one's attention on the component elements of whatever dream presented itself. Then Don Juan had showed me energetically what the sorcerers of ancient Mexico considered to be the origin of dream, the displacement of the assemblage point. He said that the assemblage point was displaced very naturally during sleep, but that to see the displacement was a bit difficult because it required an aggressive mood, and that such an aggressive mood had been the predilection of the sorcerers of ancient Mexico. Those sorcerers, according to Don Juan, had found all the premises of their sorcery by means of this mood.
It is a very predatory mood,
Don Juan went on.
It's not difficult at all to enter into it, because man, predator by nature. You could see, aggressively, anybody in this little village, or perhaps someone far away while they're asleep. Anyone would do for the purpose at hand. What's important is that you arrive at a complete sense of indifference. You are in search of something, and you are out to get it. You're going to go out looking for a person, searching like a feline, like an animal of prey, for someone to descend on.
Don Juan had told me, laughing at my apparent chagrin, that the difficulty with this technique was the mood, and that I couldn't be passive in the act of seeing, for the sight was not something to watch, but to act upon. It might have been the power of his suggestion, but that day, when he had told me all this, I felt astoundingly aggressive. Every muscle of my body was filled to the brim with energy, and in my dreaming practice, I did go after someone. I wasn't interested in who that someone might have been. I needed someone who was asleep, and some force I was aware of, without being fully conscious of it, had guided me to find that someone. I never knew who the person was, but while I was seeing that person, I felt Don Juan's presence. It was a strange sensation of knowing that someone was with me by an undetermined sensation of proximity that was happening at a level of awareness that wasn't part of anything that I had ever experienced. I could only focus my attention on the individual at rest. I knew that he was a male, but I don't know how I knew that. I knew that he was asleep because the ball of energy that human beings ordinarily are was a little bit flat. It was expanded laterally. And then I saw the assemblage point at a position different from the habitual one, which is right behind the shoulder blades. In this instance, it had been displaced to the right of where it should have been, and a bit lower. I calculated that in this case it had moved to the side of the ribs. Another thing that I noticed was that there was no stability to it. It fluctuated erratically, and then abruptly went back to its normal position. I had the clear sensation that obviously my presence and Don Juan's had awakened the individual. I had experienced a profusion of blurred images right after that, and then I woke up back in the place where I'd started. Don Juan had also told me all along that sorcerers were divided into two groups. One group was dreamers, the other was stalkers. The dreamers were those who had a great facility for displacing the assemblage point. The stalkers were those who had a great facility for maintaining the assemblage point fixed on that new position. Dreamers and stalkers complemented each other and worked in pairs, affecting one another with their given proclivities. Don Juan had assured me that the displacement and the fixation of the assemblage point could be realized at will by means of the sorcerer's iron-handed discipline. He said that the sorcerers of his lineage believed that there were at least 600 points within the luminous sphere that we are, that when reached at will by the assemblage point can each give us a totally inclusive world. Meaning that, if our assemblage point is displaced to any of these points and remains fixed on it, we will perceive a world as inclusive and total as the world of everyday life, but a different world nevertheless. Don Juan had further explained that the art of sorcery is to manipulate the assemblage point and make it change positions at will on the luminous spheres that human beings are. The result of this manipulation is a shift in the point of contact with the dark sea of awareness, which brings as its concomitant a different bundle of zillions of energy fields in the form of luminous filaments that converge on the assemblage point. The consequence of new energy fields converging on the assemblage point is that awareness of a different sort than that which is necessary for perceiving the world of everyday life enters into action, turning the new energy fields into sensory data that is interpreted and perceived as a different world, because the energy fields that engender it are different from the habitual. He had asserted that an accurate definition of sorcery as a practice would be to say that sorcery is the manipulation of the assemblage point for purposes of changing its focal point of contact with the dark sea of awareness, thus making it possible to perceive other worlds. Don Juan had said that the art of the stalkers enters into play after the assemblage point has been displaced. Maintaining the assemblage point fixed in its new position assures sorcerers that they will perceive whatever new world they enter in its absolute completeness, exactly as we do in the world of ordinary affairs. For the sorcerers of Don Juan's lineage, the world of everyday life was but one fold of a total world consisting of at least 600 folds. Don Juan went back again to the topic under discussion, my journeys through the dark sea of awareness, and said that what I'd done from my inner silence was very similar to what is done in dreaming when one is asleep. However, when journeying through the dark sea of awareness, there was no interruption of any sort caused by going to sleep, nor was there any attempt whatsoever at controlling one's attention while having a dream. The journey through the dark sea of awareness entailed an immediate response. There was an overpowering sensation of the here and now. Don Juan lamented the fact that some idiotic sorcerers had given the name dreaming awake to this act of reaching the dark sea of awareness directly, making the term dreaming even more ridiculous.
When you thought that you had the dream fantasy of going to that town of our choice,
he continued,
you had actually placed your assemblage point directly on a specific position on the dark sea of awareness that allows the journey. Then the dark sea of awareness supplied you with whatever was necessary to carry on that journey. There's no way whatsoever to choose that place at will. Sorcerers say that inner silence selects it unerringly. Simple, isn't it?
He explained to me then the intricacies of choice. He said that choice for warrior travelers was not really the act of choosing, but rather the act of acquiescing elegantly to the solicitations of infinity.
Infinity chooses, he said. The art of the warrior traveler is to have the ability to move with the slightest insinuation. The art of acquiescing to every command of infinity. For this, a warrior traveler needs prowess, strength, and above everything else, sobriety. All those three put together give, as a result, elegance.
After a moment's pause, I went back to the subject that intrigued me the most. But it's unbelievable that I actually went to that town, Don Juan, in body and soul, I said.
It is unbelievable, but it's not unlivable, he said. The universe has no limits, and the possibilities at play in the universe at large are indeed incommensurable. So don't fall prey to the axiom, I believe only what I see, because it is the dumbest stand one can possibly take.
Don Juan's elucidation had been crystal clear. It made sense, but I didn't know where it made sense. Certainly not in my daily world of usual affairs. Don Juan assured me then, unleashing a great trepidation in me, that there was only one way in which sorcerers could handle all this information. To taste it through experience, because the mind was incapable of taking in all that stimulation. What do you want me to do, Don Juan? I asked.
You must deliberately journey through the dark sea of awareness, he replied. But you'll never know how this is done. Let's say that inner silence does it, following inexplicable ways, ways that cannot be understood, but only practiced.
Don Juan had me sit down on my bed and adopt the position that fostered inner silence. I usually fell asleep instantly whenever I adopted this position. However, when I was with Don Juan, his presence always made it impossible for me to fall asleep. Instead, I entered into a veritable state of complete quietude. This time, after an instant of silence, I found myself walking. Don Juan was guiding me by holding my arm as we walked. We were no longer in his house. We were walking in a Yaqui town I'd never been in before. I knew of the town's existence. I had been close to it many times, but I'd been made to turn around by the sheer hostility of the people who lived around it. It was a town where it was nearly impossible for a stranger to enter. The only non-Yaquis who had free access to that town were the supervisors from the federal bank, because of the fact that the bank bought the crops from the Yaqui farmers. The endless negotiations of the Yaqui farmers revolved around getting cash advances from the bank on the basis of a near speculation process about future crops. I instantly recognized the town from the descriptions of people who had been there. As if to increase my astonishment, Don Juan whispered in my ear that we were in the Yaqui town in question. I wanted to ask him how we'd gotten there, but I couldn't articulate my words. There were a large number of Indians talking in argumentative tones. Tempers seemed to flare. I didn't understand a word of what they were saying, but the moment I conceived of the thought that I couldn't understand, something cleared up. It was very much as if more light went into the scene. Things became very defined and neat, and I understood what the people were saying, although I didn't know how. I didn't speak their language. The words were definitely understandable to me, not singularly, but in clusters, as if my mind could pick up whole patterns of thought. I could say, in earnest, that I got the shock of a lifetime, not so much because I understood what they were saying, but because of the content of what they were saying. Those people were, indeed, warlike. They were not Western men at all. Their propositions were propositions of strife, warfare, strategy. They were measuring their strength, their striking resources, and lamenting the fact that they had no power to deliver their blows. I registered in my body the anguish of their impotence. All they had were sticks and stones to fight high-technology weapons. They mourned the fact that they had no leaders. They coveted, more than anything else one could imagine, the rise of some charismatic fighter who could galvanize them. I heard then the voice of cynicism. One of them expressed a thought that seemed to devastate everyone equally, including me, for I seemed to be an indivisible part of them. He said that they were defeated beyond salvation, because if at a given moment one of them had the charisma to rise up and rally them, he would be betrayed because of envy and jealousy and hurt feelings. I wanted to comment to Don Juan on what was happening to me, but I couldn't voice a single word. Only Don Juan could talk.
The Yaquis are not unique in their pettiness,
he said in my ear.
It is a condition in which human beings are trapped, a condition that is not even human, but imposed from the outside.
I felt my mouth opening and closing involuntarily as I tried desperately to ask a question that I couldn't even conceive of. My mind went blank, void of thoughts. Don Juan and I were in the middle of a circle of people, but none of them seemed to have noticed us. I didn't record any movement, reaction, or furtive glance that may have indicated that they were aware of us. The next instant, I found myself in a Mexican town built around a railroad station, a town located about 1.5 miles east of where Don Juan lived. Don Juan and I were in the middle of the street by the government bank. Immediately afterward, I saw one of the strangest sights I had ever been witness to in Don Juan's world. I was seeing energy as it flows in the universe, but I wasn't seeing human beings as spherical or oblong blobs of energy. The people around me were, in one instant, the normal beings of everyday life, and in the next instant, they were strange creatures. It was as if the ball of energy that we are were transparent. It was like a halo around an insect-like core. That core didn't have a primate's shape. There were no skeletal pieces, so I wasn't seeing people as if I had X-ray vision that went to the bone core. At the core of people, there were, rather, geometric shapes made of what seemed to be hard vibrations of matter. That core was like letters of the alphabet. A capital T seemed to be the main structural support. An inverted, thick L was suspended in front of the T. The Greek letter for delta, which went almost to the floor, was at the bottom of the vertical bar of the T and seemed to be a support for the whole structure. On top of the letter T, I saw a rope-like strand, perhaps an inch in diameter. It went through the top of the luminous sphere as if what I was seeing were indeed a gigantic bead hanging from the top like a drooping gem. Once, Don Juan had presented to me a metaphor to describe the energetic union of strands of human beings. He had said that the sorcerers of ancient Mexico described those strands as a curtain made from beads strung on a string. I had taken this description literally and thought that the string went through the conglomerate of energy fields that we are from head to toe. The attaching string I was seeing made the round shape of the energy fields of human beings look more like a pendant. I didn't see, however, any other creature being strung by the same string. Every single creature that I saw was a geometrically patterned being that had a sort of string on the upper part of its spherical halo. The string reminded me immensely of the segmented, worm-like shapes that some of us see with the eyelids half closed when we're in sunlight. Don Juan and I walked in the town from one end to the other, and I saw literally scores of geometrically patterned creatures. My ability to see them was unstable in the extreme. I would see them for an instant, and then I would lose sight of them, and I would be faced with average people. Soon I became exhausted, and I could see only normal people. Don Juan said that it was time to go back home, and again, something in me lost my usual sense of continuity. I found myself in Don Juan's house without having the slightest notion as to how I had covered the distance from the town to the house. I lay down in my bed and tried desperately to recollect, to call back my memory, to probe the depths of my very being for a clue as to how I had gone to the Yaqui town and to the railroad station town. I didn't believe that they had been dream fantasies because the scenes were too detailed to be anything but real, and yet they couldn't possibly have been real.
"You're wasting your time,"
Don Juan said, laughing.
"I guarantee you that you will never know how we got from the house to the Yaqui town, and from the Yaqui town to the railroad station, and from the railroad station to the house. There was a break in the continuity of time. That is what inner silence does."
He patiently explained to me that the interruption of that flow of continuity that makes the world understandable to us is sorcery. He remarked that I had journeyed that day through the dark sea of awareness, and that I had seen people as they are, engaged in people's business. And then I had seen the strand of energy that joins specific lines of human beings. Don Juan reiterated to me over and over that I had witnessed something specific and inexplicable. I had understood what people were saying without knowing their language, and I had seen the strand of energy that connected human beings to certain other beings, and I had selected those aspects through an act of intending it. He stressed the fact that this intending I had done was not something conscious or volitional. The intending had been done at a deep level and had been ruled by necessity. I needed to become cognizant of some of the possibilities of journeying through the dark sea of awareness, and my inner silence had guided intent, a perennial force in the universe, to fulfill that need. Inorganic awareness. At a given moment in my apprenticeship, Don Juan revealed to me the complexity of his life situation. He had maintained, to my chagrin and despondency, that he lived in the shack in the state of Sonora, Mexico, because that shack depicted my state of awareness. I didn't quite believe that he really meant that I was so meager, nor did I believe that he had other places to live, as he was claiming. It turned out that he was right on both counts. My state of awareness was very meager, and he did have other places where he could live, infinitely more comfortable than the shack where I had first found him. Nor was he the solitary sorcerer that I had thought him to be, but the leader of a group of 15 other warrior travelers, 10 women and 5 men. My surprise was gigantic when he took me to his house in central Mexico, where he and his companion sorcerers lived. "Did you live in Sonora just because of me, Don Juan?" I asked him, unable to stand the responsibility, which filled me with guilt and remorse and a sensation of worthlessness.
"Well, I didn't actually live there," he said, laughing. "I just met you there."
But you never knew when I was coming to see you, Don Juan," I said. "I had no means to let you know."
"Well, if you remember correctly," he said, "there were many, many times when you didn't find me. You had to sit patiently and wait for me for days sometimes."
"Did you fly from here to Guaymas, Don Juan?" I asked him, in earnest. I thought that the shortest way would have been to take a plane.
"No, I didn't fly to Guaymas,"
he said with a big smile.
"I flew directly to the shack where you were waiting."
I knew that he was purposefully telling me something that my linear mind could not understand or accept, something that was confusing me to no end. I was at the level of awareness in those days when I asked myself incessantly a fatal question. What if all that Don Juan says is true? I didn't want to ask him any more questions because I was hopelessly lost trying to bridge our 2 tracks of thought and action. In his new surroundings, Don Juan began painstakingly to instruct me in a more complex facet of his knowledge, a facet that required all my attention, a facet in which merely suspending judgment was not enough. This was the time when I had to plummet down into the depths of his knowledge. I had to cease to be objective, and at the same time I had to desist from being subjective. One day, I was helping Don Juan clean some bamboo poles in the back of his house. He asked me to put on some working gloves because he said the splinters of bamboo were very sharp and easily caused infections. He directed me on how to use a knife to clean the bamboo. I became immersed in the work. When Don Juan began to talk to me, I had to stop working in order to pay attention. He told me that I had worked long enough and that we should go into the house. He asked me to sit down in a very comfortable armchair in his spacious, almost empty living room. He gave me some nuts, dried apricots, and slices of cheese neatly arranged on a plate. I protested that I wanted to finish cleaning the bamboo. I didn't want to eat, but he didn't pay attention to me. He recommended that I nibble slowly and carefully, for I would need a steady supply of food in order to be alert and attentive to what he was going to tell me.
"You already know," he began, "that there exists in the universe a perennial force which the sorcerers of ancient Mexico called the Dark Sea of Awareness. While they were at the maximum of their perceiving power, they saw something that made them shake in their pantaloons, if they were wearing any. They saw that the Dark Sea of Awareness is responsible not only for the awareness of organisms, but also for the awareness of entities that don't have an organism."
What is this, Don Juan? Beings without an organism that have awareness? I asked, astonished, for he'd never mentioned such an idea before.
"The old shamans discovered that the entire universe is composed of twin forces,
he began.
Forces that are, at the same time, opposed and complementary to each other. It is inescapable that our world is a twin world. Its opposite and complementary world is one populated by beings that have awareness, but not an organism. For this reason, the old shamans called them inorganic beings.
And where is this world, Don Juan? I asked, munching unconsciously on a piece of dried apricot.
Here, where you and I are sitting,
he replied matter-of-factly, but laughing outright at my nervousness.
I told you that it's our twin world, so it's intimately related to us. The sorcerers of ancient Mexico didn't think like you do in terms of space and time. They thought exclusively in terms of awareness. Two types of awareness coexist without ever impinging on each other because each type is entirely different from the other. The old shamans faced this problem of coexistence without concerning themselves with time and space. They reasoned that the degree of awareness of organic beings and the degree of awareness of inorganic beings were so different that both could coexist with the most minimal interference.
Can we perceive those inorganic beings, Don Juan? I asked.
We certainly can,
he replied.
Sorcerers do it at will. Average people do it, but they don't realize that they're doing it because they're not conscious of the existence of a twin world. When they think of a twin world, they enter into all kinds of mental masturbation, but it has never occurred to them that their fantasies have their origin in a subliminal knowledge that all of us have, that we are not alone.
I was riveted by Don Juan's words. Suddenly, I had become voraciously hungry. There was an emptiness in the pit of my stomach. All I could do was to listen as carefully as I could and eat.
The difficulty with your facing things in terms of time and space, he continued, is that you only notice if something has landed in the space and time at your disposal, which is very limited. Sorcerers, on the other hand, have a vast field on which they can notice if something extraneous has landed. Lots of entities from the universe at large, entities that possess awareness but not an organism, land in the field of awareness of our world, or the field of awareness of its twin world, without an average human being ever noticing them. The entities that land on our field of awareness, or the field of awareness of our twin world, belong to other worlds that exist besides our world and its twin. The universe at large is crammed to the brim with worlds of awareness, organic and inorganic.
Don Juan continued talking and said that those sorcerers knew when inorganic awareness from other worlds besides our twin world had landed in their field of awareness. He said that, as every human being on this earth would do, those shamans made endless classifications of different types of this energy that has awareness. They knew them by the general term inorganic being. Do those inorganic beings have life like we have life? I asked.
If you think that life is to be aware, then they do have life, he said. I suppose it would be accurate to say that if life can be measured by the intensity, the sharpness, the duration of that awareness, I can sincerely say that they are more alive than you and I.
Do those inorganic beings die, Don Juan? I asked. Don Juan chuckled for a moment before he answered.
If you call death the termination of awareness, yes, they die. Their awareness ends. Their death is rather like the death of a human being, and at the same time it isn't, because the death of human beings has a hidden option. It's something like a clause in a legal document, a clause that is written in tiny letters that you can barely see. You have to use a magnifying glass to read it, and yet it's the most important clause of the document.
What's the hidden option, Don Juan?
Death's hidden option is exclusively for sorcerers. They are the only ones who have, to my knowledge, read the fine print. For them, the option is pertinent and functional. For average human beings, death means the termination of their awareness, the end of their organism. For the inorganic beings, death means the same, the end of their awareness. In both cases, the impact of death is the act of being sucked into the dark sea of awareness. Their individual awareness, loaded with their life experiences, breaks its boundaries, and awareness as energy spills out into the dark sea of awareness.
But what is death's hidden option that is picked up only by sorcerers, Don Juan? I asked.
For a sorcerer, death is a unifying factor. Instead of disintegrating the organism, as is ordinarily the case, death unifies it.
How can death unify anything? I protested.
Death for a sorcerer, he said, terminates the reign of individual moods in the body. The old sorcerers believed it was the dominion of the different parts of the body that ruled the moods and the actions of the total body. Parts that become dysfunctional drag the rest of the body to chaos, such as, for instance, when you yourself get sick from eating junk. In that case, the mood of your stomach affects everything else. Death eradicates the dominion of those individual parts. It unifies their awareness into one single unit.
Do you mean that after they die, sorcerers are still aware? I asked.
For sorcerers, death is an act of unification that employs every bit of their energy. You are thinking of death as a corpse in front of you, a body on which decay has settled. For sorcerers, when the act of unification takes place, there is no corpse. There is no decay. Their bodies, in their entirety, have been turned into energy, energy possessing awareness that is not fragmented. The boundaries that are set up by the organism, boundaries which are broken down by death, are still functioning in the case of sorcerers, although they are no longer visible to the naked eye. I know that you're dying to ask me, he continued with a broad smile, if whatever I'm describing is the soul that goes to hell or heaven. No, it is not the soul. What happens to sorcerers when they pick up that hidden option of death is that they turn into inorganic beings, very specialized, high-speed inorganic beings, beings capable of stupendous maneuvers of perception. Sorcerers enter then into what the shamans of ancient Mexico called their definitive journey. Infinity becomes their realm of action.
Do you mean by this, Don Juan, that they become eternal?
My sobriety as a sorcerer tells me, he said, that their awareness will terminate the way inorganic beings' awareness terminates. But I haven't seen this happen. I have no first-hand knowledge of it. The old sorcerers believed that the awareness of this type of inorganic being would last as long as the earth is alive. The earth is their matrix. As long as it prevails, their awareness continues. To me, this is a most reasonable statement.
The continuity and order of Don Juan's explanation had been, for me, superb. I had no way whatsoever in which to contribute. He left me with a sensation of mystery and unvoiced expectations to be fulfilled. On my next visit to Don Juan, I began my conversation by asking him eagerly a question that was foremost in my mind. Is there a possibility, Don Juan, that ghosts and apparitions really exist?
Whatever you may call a ghost or an apparition, he said, when it's scrutinized by a sorcerer, boils down to one issue. It is possible that any of those ghost-like apparitions may be a conglomeration of energy fields that have awareness, and which we turn into things we know. If that's the case, then the apparitions have energy. Sorcerers call them energy-generating configuration. Or, no energy emanates from them, in which case they are phantasmagorical creations, usually of a very strong person, strong in terms of awareness. One story that intrigued me immensely, Don Juan continued, was the story you told me once about your aunt. Do you remember it?
I had told Don Juan that when I was 14 years old, I'd gone to live in my father's sister's house. She lived in a gigantic house that had 3 patios, with living accommodations in between each of them, bedrooms, living rooms, etc. The first patio was very austere, cobblestone. They told me that it was a colonial house, and this first patio was where horse-drawn carriages had gone in. The second patio was a beautiful orchard, zigzagged by brick lanes of Moorish design and filled with fruit trees. The third patio was covered with flower pots hanging from the eaves of the roof, birds and cages, and a colonial-style fountain in the middle of it, with running water, as well as a large area fenced with chicken wire set aside for my aunt's prized fighting cocks, her predilection in life. My aunt made available to me a whole apartment right in front of the fruit orchard. I thought I was going to have the time of my life there. I could eat all the fruit that I wanted. No one else in the household touched the fruit of any of those trees, for reasons that were never revealed to me. The household was composed of my aunt, a tall, round-faced, chubby lady in her 50s, very jovial, a great raconteur, and full of eccentricities that she hid behind a formal facade and the appearance of devout Catholicism. There was a butler, a tall, imposing man in his early 40s who had been a sergeant major in the army and had been lured out of the service to occupy the better-paid position of butler, bodyguard, and all-around man in my aunt's house. His wife, a beautiful young woman, was my aunt's companion, cook, and confidant. The couple also had a daughter, a chubby little girl who looked exactly like my aunt. The likeness was so strong that my aunt had adopted her legally. Those 4 were the quietest people I had ever met. They lived a very sedate life, punctuated only by the eccentricities of my aunt, who, on the spur of the moment, would decide to take trips or buy promising new fighting cocks, train them, and actually have serious contests in which enormous sums of money were involved. She tended her fighting cocks with loving care, sometimes all day long. She wore thick leather gloves and stiff leather leggings to keep the fighting cocks from spurring her. I spent 2 stupendous months living in my aunt's house. She taught me music in the afternoons and told me endless stories about my family's ancestors. My living situation was ideal for me because I used to go out with my friends and didn't have to report the time I came back to anybody. Sometimes I used to spend hours without falling asleep, lying on my bed. I used to keep my window open to let the smell of orange blossoms fill my room. Whenever I was lying there awake, I would hear someone walking down the long corridor that ran the length of the whole property on the north side, joining all the patios of the house. This corridor had beautiful arches and a tiled floor. There were 4 light bulbs of minimal voltage that dimly illuminated the corridor, lights that were turned on at 6 o'clock every evening and turned off at 6 in the morning. I asked my aunt if anyone walked at night and stopped at my window, because whoever was walking always stopped by my window, turned around, and walked back again toward the main entrance of the house. "Don't trouble yourself with nonsense, dear," my aunt said, smiling. "It's probably my butler making his round. Big deal. Were you frightened?" "No, I was not frightened," I said. "I just got curious because your butler walks up to my room every night. Sometimes his steps wake me up. She discarded my inquiry in a matter-of-fact fashion, saying that the butler had been a military man and was habituated to making his rounds as a sentry would. I accepted her explanation. One day, I mentioned to the butler that his steps were just too loud and asked if he would make his rounds by my window with a little more care